I'm super excited to have this conversation for a variety of reasons. The kind of short background is this show began as a show about polling to kind of try to demystify it for audiences that are interested in it but don't really understand how it works. And I think over the course of last year, we were able to explain a lot about political polling. But it seems like there are bigger questions that the audience is interested in that aren't just like how you ask questions and how you get answers, but also how you figure out what to ask and how people are processing those questions and how we make meaning out of the information that we get. And in particular, I think people are very curious about what's happening with democracy. So so I reached out to Pew once again to talk to you two about some of the research that you have done on people's attitudes towards how democracy is working for them in democracies around the world. And so I just want to thank you both, Richard and Patrick, for coming on to talk to me about this today. I guess maybe a starting point is how far back does the democracy research go for Pew? How long have you been studying this?
Yeah, I mean, internationally, we've been doing it really for over 2 decades now in one way or another. If you go back to, I think, the very first global attitude survey at Pew back in 2002, you would see some questions on democracy there. So we've done it in different ways over time, but it's been a long-running theme of ours. I think, probably in the last few years, we've put even more emphasis on it, as I think the health of democracy, has declined in many parts of the world. If you look at, Freedom House, Economist Intelligence Unit, VDM, International IDEA, all these ratings organizations that look at the health of democracy, they've all shown that we're in an era of democratic erosion, democratic backsliding, and it's become more of I think an issue that is getting attention around the world, right? So it's felt like a time where we'd want to put even more attention on the issue of democracy and how people feel about it. So it's been a bigger and bigger part of our work in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Is it something that you both had been studying previously, or was it an evolution from previous work?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been at the center for 20 years. So, I've been doing this for a while here, I guess. I've always been interested in it. My background is as a political scientist. So for me, it's a long running interest. I don't know, Pat, if you want to talk about, previous work you've done on this area.
Yeah, no, before coming to the center, and I've been here for about 8.5 years now. I was at the U.S. State Department, where the office I was in did international polling. So clearly democracy was a core part of that. And before that, I was at ABC News and doing political polling, which it sounds like you've had a number of guests on about that recently. So kind of steeped into political polling that way and issues surrounding democracy.
Yeah. And so maybe a kind of place to start is defining terms. And I think one of the things that I'm curious about is this term democratic erosion. And, I guess one way of thinking about that is sort of there's the supply side of that and the demand side of that. And so there's the democratic erosion of, actual governments and governance. And then there is and candidates and rhetoric. And then there is also kind of citizen demand for democratic institutions, citizen trust in democratic institutions. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you understand the term and what it is you're trying to kind of assess when you talk about democratic erosion.
Yeah, I guess, how we would approach it is we try to ask people questions about democratic principles, democratic rights and institutions, and track over time what we see in terms of support for those principles, rights, and institutions. So we wouldn't ask people whether they think democracy is eroding in their country or something like that, but we try to measure over time people's democratic values, and beyond that, also just their own perceptions of how democracy is functioning. What do they think in their own, what do they think is happening in their country in terms of the quality of democracy? What kind of concerns do they have, and try to break it down a little bit. Why might we be seeing this pattern of democratic erosion? What is it about public opinion that's creating an environment in which that erosion takes place?
I think one of the other reasons I was curious to talk to you is there had been a variety of, articles and analysts, people like Yascha Mounk and others who had been promoting research about particularly young people, saying that maybe they didn't care whether it was a democracy or a dictatorship. I think some of that data is a little overblown, but I think that is kind of an interesting new kind of concern, not new, but certainly over the last several years, an increasing concern is what is it that is driving some electorates, some polities to feel that their democracy is not working as well versus the ones who have. And I know you've done this kind of across like 31 countries. So maybe you could talk a bit about at a high level what you're seeing there. Is it a uniform backsliding? Is it only happening in some places?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Yasha Monk, Roberto Foa, and folks like that have done some interesting work on, using world values survey questions and things like that. That probably a lot of people, in this audience would be familiar with. And we've asked some similar kind of questions to what the World Values Survey has asked in terms of views about different types of government. For instance, we've asked questions about whether people think representative democracy is a good way of governing, direct democracy. We've also asked about more authoritarian forms of government, military rule by a strong leader. And we have seen that, sort of strong support for representative democracy has dropped off in a lot of places in recent years. The percentage of people who say it's a very good system, right, has kind of dropped off a bit. At the same time, some of these more authoritarian approaches, like a strong leader model, support for them, for those approaches has grown a bit in some countries, right? I wouldn't want to overstate it, but it is, a bit of a trend that we see. And I think overall, our interpretation of a lot of those questions about different types of political regimes or types of government is that there's still a lot of support for representative democracy. Overwhelmingly, people say it's a good way to govern their country. But they're also, maybe to a surprising degree in a lot of places, open to non-democratic alternatives as well. And their confidence in representative democracy maybe isn't as strong as we might think. And, overall, their commitment to democracy isn't as strong as we might think or we might hope. And that lack of commitment can open up political space in a way for would-be autocrats to come along and try to take advantage of. And I think that's something we've seen play out politically in different parts of the world in recent years.
And I'm wondering, a thing that you sometimes hear, particularly for people who are conducting political focus groups for campaigns or on behalf of a PAC or something like that, is a little bit of skepticism that people even know what we're talking about when we use the word democracy, that it's kind of an abstraction and may not have a lot of context or meat on the bones for the average person. And I'm curious what you think about that. Is that something you think is accurate? Do you think it's just sort of, what do you think when people respond to this question, they're interpreting the word democracy, or more specifically representative democracy, to mean?
Yeah, I can go, and Pat, you may have thoughts on this too. I think there has been some research showing, that people do have basic ideas about the principles of democracy, some more kind of open-ended, qualitative kind of research has been done comparatively in the past. One of the things we do is we certainly do ask questions where we use the word democracy, but we also ask about specific, democratic principles and rights and things like that. And what we generally see is there's a lot of support for those things. So, I understand when people say that. And sure, if you call somebody up and ask them to define democracy, on the phone out of the blue, are they going to give you a great answer? It's super coherent and well thought out, political theory?
Right.
Probably not, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'm a little less skeptical. I think people probably do have some basic understanding of the concepts we're talking about when we talk about democracy. It varies a little bit, but I don't think it's I don't think it's a meaningless term or something you can't use in survey research.
Is that
Yeah.
something you're observing too, Pat? Yeah.
Well, sorry, I just wanted to add in there, since we're talking about a cross-national context with Richard's Global Attitude Survey, that the questionnaire is fully translated, verified by experts, and reviewed by our local in-country partners. And the emphasis for us is on comprehension and understanding. So we're not simply translating the English questionnaire word for word. So it's a real
Right.
focus on meaning. And as part of our protocols in executing the study, we do a rigorous pretest. So the
Hmm.
interviewers will relay back if folks are having trouble with meanings of particular words, and that suggests to us that perhaps we have to reword the question and approach a concept differently.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good segue into methodology because the 31 country study is particularly interesting because I think in the American context, in the UK context, we're sort of used to online panels or online surveys, but this has some differences depending on countries and regions where quite a few countries are doing this on a phone survey basis, a person-to-person interviewer. Others are in-person, face-to-face interviews, and other places. So it's a mix of sampling and fielding methodologies. And maybe you can talk a bit about why those differences exist.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, it's a real challenge working across national context, like Richard's study does. Um, and I think the one takeaway I would have for your listeners is that we really, focus on the fact that a one size fits all approach does not work
Hmm.
clearly. So we try and be realistic about what we can and cannot do in each particular country. And what that means is that what works well in country A is simply not going to work at all
Hmm.
in country B and the following ones. And why is that? Well, thinking about phone surveys, and we do phone surveys in a relatively high proportion of the countries. In fact, we moved exclusively to phone during the COVID pandemic out
Hmm.
of fear of transmission, and we wanted to protect the safety of
Right.
our interviewers and respondents. Um, but phone penetration varies across countries,
Hmm.
um, as does internet access.
Right.
Uh, some countries have updated censuses and others don't. The
Mm.
experience and expertise of local vendors that varies in their capacity to execute a certain type of study.
Right.
That varies. We might have in mind that an online probability survey would be the optimal way to go because that's what we use in the United States as part of the American Trends Panel. But that certainly will not work in countries where internet penetration is low, and that the commercial market doesn't have that type of panel available for us to
Hmm.
fold the survey in. So all that's to say that the markets vary. So the Global Attitudes Project really needs to be flexible over time.
Hmm. I would imagine that there are also, across those countries, not well, famously, I think only one country has ever had our constitution besides us, and it was like the Philippines for a while. I think it's because we imposed it on them, if I remember this correctly from law school. But nobody else does democracy the way we do it. But also, everybody doesn't do parliamentary democracy. Some do unicameral, some do bicameral, some have weak presidents and strong prime ministers. I mean, there's a lot of different methods here. Um, you know, S- Singapore, some people kind of colloquially don't even really understand to be a democracy because it's kind of a democratic system with a single party. And so, is it a true choice? But it's in the list because people vote and there is representation. How do you approach that distinction? Because obviously, or does it matter? Just sort of in context, everyone understands that when you're asking about democracy, they assume it's theirs, their version of it.
Yeah, I think we usually, phrase questions on how's democracy working in your country and things like that, right? So we, put some sort of contextualization around it. Also when you're asking about some principles like free speech or gender
Hmm.
equality or things like that, those are things that I think can be, the concepts at least that we can ask about across nations. And then sometimes you want to look at the institutional arrangements or the political conditions in a country to see if they help explain anything in the cross-national
Mm.
patterns that you see. I mean, there's certainly different, levels of polarization, for example, in the countries that we look at, and we try to understand, well, how might that affect the kind of answers that we see? We see that the United States, for example, stands out on lots of different questions that we ask. Americans are a bit more negative about the way democracy is working in certain ways, a bit more negative about how their politics is functioning in certain ways than
Hmm.
others around the world. They're more divided on lots of different issues than others around the world. If you ask about, climate change or
Mm.
abortion or same-sex marriage or even questions about political reform and things like that, Americans look more divided. Well, you can certainly make an argument that's also tied to the institutional arrangements in the United States, the two-party system, all sorts of things that might help explain why we have significantly kind of higher levels of polarization in the U.S. compared to the rest of the world. So,
Hmm.
sometimes to me, the way those different kind of political institutions come into play is that they can help you understand a little bit the data that you're seeing.
And this, I think, is the thing I wanted to kind of dial in on, because I think sometimes the kind of rolled up top line reported on version of this type of research is almost as if people are grading uh, governmental systems, right? As if it's like, do you like democracy? But that's not the question you ask. The question you ask is more about the performance of democracy in each country, how people are feeling that it is working in that country. And my sort of surmise from looking over the research that you've done is a lot of this is about, a sense of efficacy, a sense of delivering, of getting things done, of being kind of salient to people's day-to-day lives and being able to connect things that are working well in their lives with things the government is doing. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, if you're looking at the frustrations people have, the dissatisfaction people say they have with the functioning of democracy, I don't think it's necessarily at all about them not supporting democracy, not having democratic values. In some ways, they want a representative democracy that's more representative and more democratic, right? Especially on
Hmm.
the representation front. You asked earlier, what's driving some of these negative trends. Yeah, a lot in part. I mean, it's a lot of things can be driving the unhappiness people have with the way democracy is working. But part of it's about representation. I think that's really a story that jumps out in our data.
Hmm.
We get these large percentages of people across the countries we survey saying, "I don't think elected officials listen to people like me, care what we think."
Hmm.
Significant numbers say there's no political party out there that represents my views. A lot in the data is suggesting that, beyond kind of, social issues and beyond economic frustrations people have, they have some, real kind of complaints about the way democracy is functioning, the way politics is working. It's coming from a place of wanting a democracy that functions better rather than rejecting democracy quite often.
Hmm.
Yeah, if I may add there, I think questions in survey research work typically best when respondents have a strong interest in understanding. So avoiding these
Hmm.
abstract concepts like Richard's pointing to and talking about the concrete everyday reality that people experience is a much better way to ask questions. And I think when we're at our best, Richard, that's what we're doing.
Hmm. And that was something that stood out in one of the articles I was looking at. It was this piece back from March of last year about what can improve democracy. And I mean, straight up top in the piece, there's this infographic that is kind of fascinating, given all of the discourse over the last year, given everyone had an election last year, it seemed like, of an anti-incumbent global mood. Um, I think there is also a way where that feels like it can get kind of hand waved as like, everybody's just in a mood, as opposed to feeling like, no, there's something literally that I don't like about these incumbents. I don't like my choices. And what stuck out to me was how many countries suggested that like changes to the politicians themselves, like different choices, different candidates, or better representation from those candidates, um, talking about being more responsive to their needs, being more competent and honest, among other factors. But that was striking because it's, with like four exceptions, that seemed to be the dominant thing driving, whatever level of dissatisfaction might be present in those countries.
Yeah, exactly. This was an open-ended question where we asked people around the world, in your own words, what do you think would improve the way democracy is working in our country? And, they had a lot of things to say. People mentioned institutional reforms. They said, citizens
Hmm.
have a role. We can improve the economy. But the most common response by far was, as you suggest, we need to replace politicians. We need better politicians in our country. We need less corruption, more competency. We need more responsiveness boldness from the political class, essentially.
Hmm.
And that was, it was a pretty good, prediction in lots of ways. What we did see in this big global election year in 2024, right, where incumbents got tossed out of office in a lot of places, even, incumbents often when they held on to power in places like South Africa or India, they lost a lot of vote share. So, it was a rough year for incumbents. And, to your point, Farah, about, kind of, it's easy kind of, hand wave or a bit when you see findings like this. I don't know what you think, Pat, but I guess like over time, I've become more likely to say we should pay attention to findings like this. I think it is easy
Hmm.
to be dismissive of them and say, oh, people have never liked politicians. When are they ever going to be happy with elected officials? You do a focus group and ask people how it's going, and they're going to complain about political leaders and so forth for the first 30 minutes of the group, if you let them. So there, we know that that's something that maybe voters are inclined to do, but I think we need to listen to these kind of criticisms and complaints that people have, because what they're telling us is that something pretty fundamental about representative democracy isn't working the way it should. The
Hmm.
representation part kind of isn't there in the way it should be. And I think you see frustrations with that playing out politically increasingly around the world. And, yeah, election year 2024 was another example of that.
Hmm. The thing that also stood out was how, for several of these 9 countries or something, at least, no more than that, as I'm looking at this chart, many countries, politicians were kind of a big issue. But it looks like in the US, government reform and the people operating the government, people representing us, kind of were mixed as concerns. Maybe you can talk a bit about how that manifested in these open ends. How did Americans talk about what they thought was holding back democracy?
Yeah, I think Americans also had some of the same sort of suggestions about replacing politicians, but it was also a place where you saw a relatively high number of people saying things about institutional change or government reforms, a whole host of different things, right?
Hmm.
Maybe age limits on elected officials, or, age limits on Supreme Court justices, getting rid of the Electoral College, and various kinds of institutional changes were mentioned more often in the US than some other places. And there's another question we've asked before too, where we ask people, how much essentially do we need political reform in our country, and how much of it do we need essentially? And what we see is that in many countries, a pretty high number of people say we need either major changes to our political system, or maybe even a complete overhaul of it. And the US is one of the places where you see among the highest percentage of people saying we need either, major changes or this complete reform of the government. So I think in
Mm.
different ways, Americans stand out, as I said, as being pretty unhappy with the way the political system is functioning, and also among, the most likely to say, okay, we need reform. And in that open-ended question, they have some ideas about, how we should go
Hmm.
about doing that.
This is particularly interesting just on the topic of taking it seriously, and that while, my limited experience with doing political focus groups was in the spring in Pennsylvania. And so before they get to not liking the candidates, they spend 10 minutes on potholes. But nevertheless, there is a very interesting kind of like intuition, I guess. Intuition is a little rude, I think, actually. I think it's an awareness, an observation that these things just are not keeping up with the needs of a country of this size, of a population this diverse, of states with different, geographic and industrial and population needs. And that, like, there is some sort of sense that this 18th century system that we have is maybe in need of modernization. And it's interesting that I think we kind of dismiss the voters on this topic because of maybe who they choose to ultimately, roll the dice and vote for. How are you seeing people receive this research when you see it covered, or when people engage you on it? Are they able to kind of get into that part of the conversation with you?
Yeah, I think I think our audiences are increasingly kind of looking for what are some of the deeper level reasons behind all the political disruption and upheaval that we see happening, yeah, in different countries all over the world? Again, the kind of election year 2024 was an example of that. We did a little piece at the end of last year, kind of looking at some of these trends in elections around the world. And I think you saw a lot of other people doing pieces like that too, right? Because I think there is this sense that, we're not talking about isolated kind of patterns here, or isolated sort of disruptions to political systems. There seems to be some common trends happening around the world, and why is that? And that's hopefully an area where the kind of cross national work that our team does, working really closely with Pat's team, can shed some light on. What are these patterns that we see that might explain electoral outcomes? I mean, elections are always going to be shaped in part by some local factors and what's happening specifically in that country. But if you look cross nationally, it seems like there's some trends there as well. So hopefully that's the kind of thing our work can shed some light on.
Yeah. I mean, what are you seeing as some of those kind of cross currents and influences on how people are perceiving the performance of democracy in their countries?
Yeah, I think, well, some of these things I think we talked about in terms of frustration with a political class that's seen as out of touch and unresponsive. Often a sense that, political parties don't always represent people. So there's just this, anger at political elites that plays out in lots of different ways. And, there's an economic component to it as well. Certainly if you're talking about election outcomes in 2024, perceptions about inflation were a big part of the story in a lot of different places. But I think it's more than just inflation. There's a lot of economic anxiety stemming from the past, 15 or 20 years, when we've had, a financial crisis, a great recession, the downturn associated with the pandemic, we had inflation after that. There's a lot of economic anxiety, and there's kind of this intersection between the economics and the politics of it all. We just put out a report very recently looking at views about inequality around the world. And what we saw is that people say, inequality for the most part is a big problem in our country. And we asked them about why that is. And the top reason in just about every country where we conducted the survey was that the rich have too much political power. So again, people, I think, feel a bit powerless at the moment. They feel like, power has been concentrated in these among these political elites. They feel like power has been concentrated among these economic elites, and that leads to a lot of frustration and disruption, and people looking for non-traditional parties and leaders because they feel very frustrated with the political status quo.
If I may just add a mention here, and thinking about the cross-national survey and the questionnaire that we put together, one of the real strengths of it is that we're able to make these comparisons across these countries, but the questionnaire itself has to be at a somewhat higher level, slightly more abstract than we might want. Though we may know in a particular country there's a pothole problem, as you suggested, that might not be an issue in all of the countries. So it'd be difficult for us to ask about potholes in all of the countries. Right. So it's a little bit challenging, how we can pick our spots and make country-specific questions, because we would like to have as many common questions as possible, which I think is one of the great strengths of the Global Attitudes Project. But I think when you talk about economic anxiety, the effectiveness of particular leaders, efficacy, as you mentioned earlier, Farah, I think those are concepts that give us, some analytic leverage in kind of thinking about how publics are understanding the political scene at the moment. But our ability to get down into the potholes is somewhat limited, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how widely traveled you are globally, but very few places have potholes the way Pennsylvania in the spring does. It's a very specific problem on the turnpike there. Winter is harsh.
Can I invite you to DC sometime?
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. I think, and to say nothing of the Southern State Parkway. A couple of other things that stood out to me was this sense of Americans feeling like, the system needs major changes or total reform, a complete overhaul, and that only a couple of other countries were as pronounced in their view as that. And I think it was Italy and Spain were the two that stood out there. And I'm curious, what did you learn about what's going on in Italy and Spain that's making them feel the same kind of way of we need an overhaul here?
Yeah, if you look at some of our data, I guess, in lots of different ways over the past decade and a half, I think that you would often see it's an oversimplification, but a little bit of a north-south divide in Europe with,
Hmm.
it's changing now, I think, in some ways. But if you go back over the past decade and a half at least, it's Spain, Italy, Greece in some ways looking more negative about things, certainly on the economic front. As we all know, from the Euro crisis and,
Hmm.
financial crisis, nearly 2 decades ago. The public mood got very negative with those
Yeah.
experiences that people had. In some ways, we've continued to see a pretty negative, pessimistic mood in those countries in the years since. And I think that's part of the reason why you see so many people who want change when you ask a question like that. Do you want an
Hmm.
economic change? Do you want political change? People who've gone through this difficult period of, especially on the economic front, they're more likely to say, "Yeah, we need major changes here, maybe even a complete overhaul of the system."
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about the kind of those regional differences. I was coincidentally doing a credit card study for Citibank in 2008. Which is
Oh,
a
wow.
fun time to be talking about credit cards.
Yeah, I imagine.
And I was in Madrid when the first vote on the TARP didn't go through. And we were in focus groups talking about consumer credit cards. And people were kind of like, well, I hope it's not going to hurt us. And it was just like, I don't know, you are the vacation home of England. I think this is going to be rough on you guys to have a housing credit crisis if it spills over out of the US, which of course it was going to. That was an amazing study. We were in Spain, we were in Russia, we were in Hong Kong and Singapore. And I think by the time we got to Singapore, Greenspan had said credit tsunami because people were saying that phrase. And I was like, oh, that those are two words I know. Watching those groups unfold. I think that's a pretty interesting sort of dynamic in North versus South, because I think the other thing that stood out to me was how much kind of a slim majority, but 5 point, 5, 6 point majority in some Western European countries. I mean, Sweden's still feeling pretty good about democracy, but like Germany's hanging on, doing a lot better than the UK, for instance, on its feelings about democracy, who's also doing better than France. And so what are you seeing as kind of explanations for that erosion in those countries? And also, it's not like migrants haven't been an issue for Germany. It's not like economic crises and climate refugees and whatever aren't coming through Germany. What do you think accounts for the difference between, say, the UK and Germany, or the UK, Germany, and France?
Yeah, yeah. And it'll be interesting to see. Germany's one I think is interesting to watch, right? The economy hasn't been as good there recently, and they have an election coming up, obviously, where the incumbent is in peril, right? So
Right.
it's an interesting country to see what the trajectory there will be. But this, I do think that that longer term impact of economic crisis is something that you can forget about. It hasn't sort of gone away. It's still there, and something I think causes
Hmm.
people anxiety. I feel like there's been a lot of debate about economic ratings, and Pat, you might have thoughts on, like, how do you measure economic attitudes? But I always feel like you can get a little bit too caught up as an analyst on what the quarterly GDP numbers are, what the most
Hmm.
recent, up or down is on the inflation rate or unemployment, things like that, and forget about the way people have experienced the economy, which is, again, a lot of shocks to the system over time, an ongoing, concern many have about things like economic inequality or housing, or if you're an
Mm.
American, the cost of sending your kids to college. Like, these are things that create anxiety that are there and shape how people think about economic issues beyond, again, the quarterly report that a lot of economic journalists are going to pay a lot of attention to.
Hmm. How do you go about kind of looking at those differences and those well, not those differences, but those economic factors. I think it has been very tempting, especially in the US discourse over the last year, to say, what's everybody so upset about? The unemployment rate is low and inflation is slowing and all of those things. But it doesn't deny that people don't feel good about the state of the economy. And obviously there is also the problem of distribution, who's having a good time and who's not, and how many people are in either of those camps. But how do you go about asking questions like that to try to get at people's experiences apart from economic data?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly ask more detailed questions on aspects of the economy. I think, one of the things we do is you know, working with Pat's team, we try to establish trends in lots of the world, right? So we can tell a
Hmm.
long-term story, not just a quick hit on how people feel about the economy in any, given
Hmm.
moment, but, what's the, decade or 2 decade long story on how people feel about the economy. When you do that, I think you get a better sense for, those long-term kind of issues that are shaping, public perceptions of that. And that's something we try to do more broadly in our work is, put a big emphasis on trends and, see what the long-term story is. We've been at this for a while now and, going back more than 2 decades, measuring public opinion around the world. So I think that's something we can certainly do and, is a bit of an advantage of, our institution and the kind of work we've done over time is that we have been doing it on a large scale for a long period of time and can tell those sort of long-term stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with Richard. I think focusing on people's affective reactions to broader economic circumstances is most useful for us. So anxiety, concern, worry, these types of views
Hmm.
are much more in line with our survey, and they really lean into our long-term trends, and some of which we've had for over 20 years. I think we also have to be mindful of asking too personal of a question about economics, about pocketbooks,
Hmm.
how much money people have. And
Right.
remember, we're just kind of calling people, asking for their time, and to ask them really detailed questions about their economic situation might be off-putting and
Hmm.
inappropriate. So I think we have to be mindful of that. And frankly, if we start asking about GDP and other
Yeah.
kind of precise economic indicators, well, frankly, I won't know how to write those questions. Richard, you're on your own.
Yeah, I don't
So I
know.
don't even know how respondents would react to it. I'm thinking not positively.
Yeah. I also, I mean, as a researcher myself, I find designing a methodology to kind of like fact check people's opinions is strange. Like we're asking them for their opinions. We're not asking them. It's not a quiz, right? So, and I was just talking to someone the other day, some folks from, well, now Burson, but you used to be Benenson. But like my husband and I are reasonably well off and not one percenters by any stretch, but in any event, like it's still insulting to go pay $7,500 per bag at the grocery store, when before the pandemic it was more like, depending on what you were doing, $35 to $50 a bag. Like this is, I also live in a more expensive place. There are issues with that. I don't have like a Walmart to shop from or something. It's all IGAs who don't get the good deals from the wholesalers. But I think that affective questioning is actually extremely interesting. I think one of the other things you noted in one of the pieces I was looking at is what I might broadly refer to as sort of a class distinction, that there are some places where those with a college education versus those who have not gone to a university or college, that may also play a role in people's perceptions of how things are going in a democracy. And maybe you can talk a bit about where you see that play out and where it doesn't seem to be as relevant.
Yeah, I think over time we've seen that type of thing. Sometimes it's the more educated, maybe more urban residents, and sometimes young people who may feel more positive about certain sort of, especially if you look at going back a few years, countries that were transitioning to democracy. It was sometimes those types of groups were better able to take advantage of the
Mm-hmm.
transitions that are taking place in society, and opportunities are opening up. Those are more available to some people than others, and I think that's where you can see something like education come in and play a role.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, we've generally, I mean, that was coming out of 2016. That was a lot of the analysis of the US election was college educated versus non college educated having a fairly big gap, or what we, as I think some of that analysis also got a little more nuanced and interesting over time as more data came in. But that kind of initial blush of non-college voters tended to vote for the Republican candidate and college voters tended to vote for the Democratic candidate. Obviously, race inflects that as well, and other factors. But it's interesting to look at that as a thing that I think in the US, in the UK, it's sort of taken for granted that education and class kind of go together. And in other countries, it seems like those distinctions aren't the important distinctions. Maybe there's some other set of factors at play in other parts of, say, Western Europe, for example, or maybe it's just, different tax structures make people feel differently about how wealth is distributed across the country.
Yeah, and Pat, you may have looked at this more than I have, but yeah, class is something I think it does seem like it's playing more and more of a role in some ways in politics, right? It's part of the conversation, maybe than it was a few years ago. It's not easy to measure. It's not impossible maybe to measure on surveys, but it's something that is tough cross nationally. So
Mm-hmm.
we've taken a few stabs at it, but it's something I think we want to think more about, right? What does it really mean, and what's the best way to measure it?
Yeah. I mean, it's so culturally inflected. It's hard to have a set standard way of asking that question, I imagine. Yeah. One of the other things that stood out to me was the political polarization piece. And I guess just because my husband and his family are English, which is why I spend way too much time thinking about English politics. But I was surprised that only South Korea in the 2022 survey came up as sort of feeling that strong political polarization within the country, strong conflicts between people who support different parties were an issue in how they were experiencing democracy. Without going deep into South Korean history and obviously recent developments in South Korean politics, I think that's an interesting observation as well, that while what was it, nearly 90% of Americans felt that there were this strong political polarization, South Korea was actually a little more along the path of that polarization. Are you seeing that trending in other countries? Is that a force that's starting to pick up steam in places where maybe it's less pronounced now than in the US?
Yeah, you certainly do see a lot of other countries that are divided. I mean, South Korea, as you mentioned, is the one place that kind of rivals the U.S. in terms of its perception of how divided it is politically. Another thing we do a lot of on our surveys is we use a basic kind of ideological measure in most countries and look at divisions between right and left. And the U.S., as I said, quite often stands out as being the most divided between right and left. But there's other countries who are pretty divided too in lots of ways. Israel has been divided a lot in the past. And of course, you've seen a lot of, division and political turmoil there in recent years in lots of ways. Australia's been pretty divided. There's other examples of that. And I think there are a lot of researchers out there that are increasingly studying comparative polarization who would, I think there's different views about it, but who would argue that, polarization is increasing in many parts of the world. But I think most of them would also say that the U.S. nonetheless stands out, and there are a lot of different reasons for that. Some of which at least have to do with our two-party system. But we've had a two-party system for a long time. What's happened more recently is that the parties have become more kind of cohesive, and you have this sort of hardened partisanship compared to the days when the two parties were these more big tent heterogeneous coalitions. So anyway, there's a lot of reasons why it is nonetheless, even if it's happening around the world, it's nonetheless really strong here in the U.S. And I think that shows up in lots of ways in our data.
Mm-hmm. Do you ask other countries the question about whether how they're feeling when they think about politics. I saw that there was like 2/3 of Americans feel exhausted when they think about politics. And I don't know. I would say count me in on that group. And yet I do this show, so I can't be too exhausted. I'm still talking about it, still thinking about it. But is that a trend elsewhere?
Yeah, we've debated it. I don't know what you think, Pat, but like, these terms, we have a really good translation process and really good translators, but I always worry a little bit that, exhausted, trying to
Mm-hmm.
translate that into the many, many different languages we have. Do we lose a little nuance here or there and things like that? So it makes us a little bit cautious sometimes. But I
Yeah.
think that, those kind of questions that measure feelings could be really interesting. Certainly, that's an interesting finding in the U.S. Right? Of course, everybody's very divided in these camps, but they don't really love it. Right? They're kind of
Right.
tired of it all.
I mean, that does seem like an interesting kind of challenge in question design, because I think it's very, again, plenty of writers and commentators that I read feel like, you'll hear in focus groups, you'll hear on surveys that people are, tired of the division, tired of this sort of, all or nothingness about everything, tired of the sort of gridlock that comes out of that. And then the commentator will say, and then they vote for the most polarizing person, or they vote for the most radical person, or they vote for the most intransigent person, and so their votes belie their desires. I again, qualitative researcher, I tend to think it's more complicated than that, and that there's a lot more nuance in there. So the challenge, of course, is sitting down and having a 90-minute, 2-hour conversation with some folks. It's a lot easier to get to that nuance in some ways than it is on a scalable survey where you're trying to ask consistent questions across multiple countries. So how do you approach getting into that kind of nuance, just methodologically? How do you think about designing questionnaires to be able to get there?
Yeah, I think. Part of the issue is, to what extent do people see the other side as a threat, right? When
Mm,
and maybe they are tired of all the division, but if you perceive the other side as a sort of existential threat to the country or to your view of the country, then you nonetheless might vote for um, a candidate that's maybe pretty far out there ideologically. There's research, I think, that people have done, showing that people will trade off some of their democratic values that they hold, and support a candidate that maybe breaks democratic norms if they see the other side as this kind of existential threat. So one of the things I think you can try to do is, try to look at how they see the other side and what are the stakes in an election and things like that. We haven't done quite as much of that cross nationally because it gets I think a lot of these things get a little bit tricky to do cross nationally. So
hmm
the impact of like polarization is something we want to do more on in our work, but it's we have to be mindful that it does get more complicated when you try to do it outside of one country.
Yeah, I would just chime in there. I mean, I love your point, Farah, about having a 2-hour conversation and trying to kind of get to the bottom of how folks see things. But for us, we're like in a 20-minute phone interview.
hmm
So you would love to have the opportunity to allow folks to express their variety of different views. As you both were talking before, folks who live in a multi-party system, that's not easily distinguished,
hmm
distilled into a two-party system. There's a lot more going on. There's a lot more nuance there. But again, trying to harmonize, across the countries and in a limited time, the limited time we have, and we're really appreciative of respondents who are willing to give the time to answer our questions. It does make it a little challenging, but I think, as Richard's saying, it's an avenue we've talked internally about doing more with on
mm
polarization, and look out for gap 25, 26.
hmm I mean, this is maybe a slightly in the weeds question, but you do put open ends to folks in these questionnaires, and it's a lot of open ends to code. How do you approach getting through all of that data and being able to kind of parse and make sense of it?
Well, I guess in fairness, we don't. It's nice of you to say we do a lot of them. I don't think we do a lot of them. I think we usually have, at most, Richard, cross nationally, one or two. And I think
I just
that's
mean a lot of
yeah,
responses. Yeah. Yeah.
Farrah. So,
Yeah.
but you're right. The reason why we don't is because of the taxing the burden of coding it all, and
Hmm.
have multiple people internally at Pew coding these responses, calculating their inter-rater
Right.
reliabilities and these types of things. That's a real mountain of work, and then to do it across countries.
We have to
Uh,
translate the open ends also.
there
Yes.
would be translations and whatnot, so we get the verbatims translated, so we get them back. So it's quite a lift. But being able to ask those why questions,
Hmm.
um, it really gets at the heart of what we're thinking. So our ability to test different ways of coding responses, in the future, and maybe there's a role for AI or whatnot in coding
Hmm.
open-ended responses, so we can do it much more quickly, and that would allow for us to the opportunity to ask more questions, more open-ended questions. I mean, that's that would be a real great opportunity. Although, Richard, I'm not sure how our in-country vendors would feel about asking more open-ended questions where they're typing on their
Right.
tablets
That's right.
these verbatim responses.
It's work for them too. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's great stuff, but yeah, exactly. It's a lot of work. So if we could figure
Yeah.
out ways to make it more efficient, we'd love to do more of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a thing we have been playing with a little bit on some of our studies of not really using AI to code the open ends, but to give us a starting place of codes. So like we'll feed it a sample of responses and ask it to kind of come up with summaries and themes. And it's a good place to start. It's not an exhaustive list of themes by any stretch of the imagination. It's like a very eager freshman intern. That's what I would say about it so far. Um, I guess my kind of last questions for you are around what's next. Like what are your plans for continuing to study these trends around how people are feeling about the performance of democracy in their countries?
Yeah, I think, we certainly want to, keep tracking some key things, just, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the way democracy is working. But I think over time, what we want to do is try some new angles too. We want to do some work, dive in more deeply into, okay, people say they're very dissatisfied with political leadership. What is it about political leadership that could change that would make you have
Mm,
a better impression? And what specifically is it that leads you to have all these frustrations with the political class? And we've done some of that already, and I think there's more to be done there. Maybe there's some work to be done around the issue of trust, which is
mm,
something that has been studied quite a bit among social scientists. But I think there's still a lot of concern out there that this the trust that is necessary to make a society function well, isn't there in many countries right now. And, are there particular forms of trust that
mm.
are needed in a democratic society in particular? And, measuring attitudes about those, maybe in some new ways, would be a really interesting thing to do. So I think there's ways to dive more deeply into what's behind this kind of, crisis of democracy the world seems to be experiencing in lots of ways right now.
Hmm. Are there new techniques you'd like to try out, Pat? Are there things that you're looking at as new methods and new ways of accomplishing this?
Yeah, I think what we're trying to focus on is, how do we make the Global Attitudes Project sustainable for the next 5, 10, 20 years? Um, and there, I think our focus has been a lot on, the mode of data collection and what will be the primary mode of data collection that we're using, in each country over time. And in the last, 8 years since I've been here, we've, moved, several countries from face to face to phone. We
Hmm.
moved some countries to phone to online, and we're exploring other methods of data collection. And we're really trying to thread the needle on, maintaining high, best in class data quality,
Hmm.
leveraging our in country vendors' capacity as best possible. And there's also the cost function. Things are not getting cheaper, as we were talking
No.
earlier about economic anxiety and whatnot. So we're trying to do our best about managing those three things and trying to
Yeah.
find really the best place, where respondents are most comfortable in hearing our questions, and we're able to record their answers.
Yes, I think this is one of the ongoing lessons of 20 years of working in research is, yes, we have new technology. No, it doesn't make anything cheaper because all these other costs go up. It's kind of an arms race to have more appetite and not have obvious efficiencies for getting to people. Are there any recent posts or pieces or things coming up in the near future that you want people to keep an eye out for or take a look at?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we just put out this report on views about inequality around the world. I think it's
Hmm.
really interesting. People might want to check that out. That was something we put out just a week or so ago. And then we'll have a report coming up that looks at views about free speech
Hmm.
around the world. That how important is it, and do you think we have it in our country? And I think that'll be interesting. And then our team, Pat's team, we're all hard at work right now getting a new survey in the field, and we'll have all kinds of
Hmm.
new stuff starting in late spring coming out from that survey on international affairs and kind of geopolitics, and then
Hmm.
democracy and other issues over the course of the rest of 2025 and even into next year as well. So we'll have some new data pretty soon.
That's amazing. I mean, it's such an incredible resource, and I think a lot of one of the things that I was, chewing on earlier or the last couple of days is these open ends about what could improve democracy and sort of specific from the voters' mouths, from the citizens' mouths, sort of recommendations about how politicians can get better, how the systems can get better. And I think it's really important for people to take a look at this work because it's so easy just to sort of say, people are checked out, they're not paying that much attention, they don't know what they're talking about, they're just in a mood, whatever. They're pawns of propaganda, etc. When there are legitimate structural forces here, and there are legitimate policy choices being made that affect how people feel about how represented they are and how effective their governments are. And I think it's important to get into the nuance of this instead of just sort of hand waving it away as just
Yeah.
another election year. Yeah.
Well, people have some things to say, right, about this topic. So thanks for bringing up the openings. I think it's a really cool project. It was a lot of work, but it led to some interesting findings. So.
Yes. And I think the other thing that's great about the work you do is the longitudinal nature of it, because even in that kind of baseline question of how do you feel democracy is performing, I can't remember the exact language of the question now, in your country, being able to look at multiple years of answers. And in a way, if you know anything about that country's politics, you can kind of go, yeah, I know, I kind of know what happened there. There's a story even in that one question that's worth unpacking and worth keeping track of as things change. So I want to thank you both, Richard and Pat, for talking to me today. I know we're at time, but this was a really great conversation, and your work is super important. So thank you for sharing it with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farah Bostic, production by The Difference Engine, and edited now by Allison Preisinger of AMP Studio. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly Substack, also available at crosstabspod.substack.com. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, and give the show a rating or review. I would love to hear from you, and it will help other people find the show. Email me if you have any questions, ideas for episode topics, suggestions for future guests, or want to talk about ways we can work together at farah@crosstabspodcast.com. See you next time.